So, welcome everybody. Can someone just give me a thumbs up if you can hear me? Just make sure we're on. Great, thank you. Uh, uh, I'm Roger Berkowitz, and thanks for joining us at the virtual reading group for the Hannah Arendt Center. Um, we're continuing reading essays and selections from this book, The Crises of the Republic, which Hannah Arendt published. And the last segment of the book is actually not an essay, but an interview that she gave to Adalbert Leif, the German journalist, in 1970. And even though it's an interview and sometimes not as exact as an essay, I've always found it to be one of the more interesting and provocative texts of Hannah Arendt's, and especially just after we finished reading and discussing on violence for the last 3 weeks, this essay or this interview picks up on many of the themes from that essay. And so I thought it would be worth taking a look at. I've sent you some discussion questions from the video. Someone, please mute your microphones if you haven't already. That would be helpful. So I gave you some ideas of what I thought was really important about this essay, this interview. To me, there are 2 or 3 segments that just jump out. One is the discussion of the prerequisites for a revolution and what she calls a revolutionary situation, and her comments on the 1960s revolutionaries or would-be revolutionaries with regard to that. Namely, the 2 parts of that really have always struck me are this idea that in order to have a revolution, you not only need a loss of power, but you need people ready and able to pick up power when it's lying in the streets. And the second part of that is her claim that the revolutionaries, the would-be revolutionaries, are not revolutionaries because they haven't engaged in a real analysis of the situation. And what that means exactly is not always clear, is slightly ambiguous. But I think from a number of things she says later in the interview and in other places, what it really means is that people are saying and expressing ideologies and cliches, Marxism, capitalism, anti-capitalism, Marxism, and she thinks that these things, these ideas, largely are ideologies and not true to the situation, and that a real revolutionary would have to have what she calls a real analysis of the existing situation in such a way that what they say speaks truth to enough people that people would, in a sense, come to join the revolution. Anyway, that's to me always been the core of this essay. There's also some really interesting parts in the end about both the loss of confidence in the system during the Vietnam War, which I think we can say is happening again in the United States around campaign finance reform and other issues, and around and across Europe as well. And then there's the discussion of the council movements at the very end, something she also talks about in On Revolution, which really is the ideal that Hannah Arendt holds out throughout all of her life for a true politics. One, she says very clearly, may not be possible. It may not be possible to bring it about, but we at least, I think, in this interview, more so than in any other text she's ever written, we get a sense of what she wants, of her ideal. And so to me, that's a very meaningful and important reason to read the text. I'm open to questions and comments about the text, relating it to the world. You're on.
I've got a question. Hello. The at the very, very beginning, she says about the determination to act, its joy in action, the assurance of being able to change things by one's own efforts. And I wondered if, thinking about later on in the text where she talks about what she'd like to happen, do you see any evidence of that happening now? People's actions bringing about change?
I think it's I mean, I'm happy to have other people jump in as well, but I'll say something quickly. Uh, I see evidence of um, uh, small movements that are creating some sense of joy. So the Tea Party, I mean, I'm going to speak largely from the United States. The Tea Party in the United States, which really began with people dressing up in funny hats and having rallies and opposing the establishment of both the Republican Party and the country, was clearly it activated a series of activists, political activists, who had largely been and felt disenfranchised and excluded from politics for many years. And there was no doubt a lot of fun in the early Tea Party experience. On the other side, Occupy Wall Street, I think, had a very similar fun aspect to it when it started. And people really did engage in the joy of talking with each other, debating politics. Many of these people hadn't debated politics before. Some obviously had. And I think, also right now with both with the Donald Trump and the Bernie Sanders phenomena, I think you're seeing people on both sides really finding, I mean, Trump is funny, he's offensive. And I think a lot of people are feeling a lot of joy in watching him speak. Other people are feeling horror, obviously. But there's no doubt that he's bringing a kind of levity and joy to many people who are his supporters. And Bernie Sanders, I think you can say very much the same thing about. He's his supporters really do feel like they're engaged in a revolution, and they feel there's something fun about the kind of politics that they're engaging in. So I think all of that is true. I think there's a desperation for that. And yet, the second part of your question is, are they making changes? So far, no. I mean, I say that maybe that's not entirely right. There's certainly been a change in the political rhetoric in this country. On both, the Trump is changing what the Republican Party is going to stand for and talk about, and certainly Bernie Sanders and Elizabeth Warren have had a huge impact in changing the narrative around the Democratic Party. Whether that and when that will actually lead to substantive changes is still an open question. So the question from an Arendtian point of view would be, to what extent are either the Trumpians or trumpeters, I guess, as some of them call themselves, or the feel the burn people, to what extent are either of them engaging in the kind of real analysis of the events that Hannah Arendt says would be necessary to really bring about a revolution, to pick up power.
How do you think? Thank you. How do you think that analysis comes about? Is that through education, or how do we adopt that kind of analysis? Is it do you think the text is suggesting? Is that why there's so much talk about the universities and student movements? Because that is the student movements that have the best chance to bring about change. Sorry, my question's vague.
No, I think for her, the student movements have a lot of good, but if they failed anywhere, it's in the intellectual side of the matter. They failed in actually coming up with a real analysis of the situation, and I think she thinks the reason for that is that they're too ideological. They're committed to, in this case, in the student movements, a kind of left-wing ideology that she thinks prevents them from actually seeing the world as it is. So when you ask how does one do that, I think it's one of the hardest questions, and I think it's really what her work is about. Hannah, if you read Hannah Arendt's work, all of it, what you'll see is someone trying to say what is, which is a phrase she uses. She sometimes says we need to think what we are doing. She also says we need to say what is. And what you'll see is that she always thinks that to say what is to not be ideological, to not take one side, because when you do so, you're not saying what is. You're saying what is within the context of a particular political or ideological view. And so universities in their best format, right, which is to be non-political and non-ideological, in her opinion, this is what she's writing in this text and also in the On Revolution and on Violence, are about saying what is. She worries that the politicization of the universities have made them less able to engage in that project, and that for her makes it less likely that a real revolution would ever come to pass. Obviously, her view of a depoliticized university is very controversial today. Most people believe that education needs to be politicized, but she has revolutionary reasons for thinking that, right? Which is that the only way to create a revolution is to actually have non-ideological, truth-seeking attempts to say what is, and that means a depoliticized, open-minded, thoughtful university system.
Thank you.
Hello, Roger, can you hear me?
Roger?
There's a
I'm
button.
sorry, is someone speaking?
Could one of you turn your mics off? Let's have Patrick start first, and then so everyone else turn your mics off but Patrick.
Okay, thank you, Dave. I'm just thinking of the situation today, getting to the Bernie Sanders phenomenon. What I interpreted her discussion here had to do with economics dominating politics, which is what the situation is currently, I take it, in any event. The Sanders thing is sort of a change from top to bottom, and which is a little bit scary for the people who are not that elite, not at the top of the ladder. You know, in other words, she talks about the working class people, how they're going to be nervous about change, especially when they think it's a change by elitists. I don't know if that factors into what the problem is of making change.
Okay, Patrick, can you turn
change? That's from the top down. And the civil rights success of the students had to do with going down and getting local voting going, not changing things at the federal level. That was the other thought I had. Thank you.
Thanks. Can you? Yeah, thank you. You have a tough connection there, Patrick. So I heard most of what you said, I think. Yeah, I don't know if anyone wants to respond to that. I mean, there's different parts of what you said. I think Arendt is worried that the elites and the working class don't speak to each other. There's no doubt about that. She thinks the elites, especially the student intellectual elites, are often speak for the working class, but don't actually listen to the working class. That's a thing. It's a comment she makes quite often, and I think that's certainly been true recently. Yeah. Any other comments or thoughts related to Patrick's or others?
Roger. I don't remember exactly where in the interview, but I saw it, whether it was there or not, a kind of advocacy for a public sphere type of social event, and to me personally, I think that's one of the things that's really lacking. I'm not in academia. I don't know what's going on the college campuses, but in the general public, there is no space within which ideas can be exchanged, and I think that's critical. I look towards technology as saying, is that a possible area? And I don't know who would make those kind of moves, but in order for what Arendt is talking about to happen, I think that the public sphere idea has to somehow be advocated.
Yeah, I'm happy. I'd love to hear what other people think of that. I mean, obviously, that is a key point of Hannah Arendt's, is that we need to have spaces. She calls them spaces of freedom or islands of freedom, where people can engage in discussion and debate and discourse about what matters in public. Um, uh, you know, the council system that she talks about at the end is one idea she has in mind. Um, you know, but there are clearly public debates and public spaces in our time. It's just a question of what they discuss and how they're structured. So I'd love to know if people agree that there's a loss of public space and what that means.
Roger, this is Jack Hirschfeld.
Hi, Jack.
I'd like to comment on two things. One, the question of public space. I believe that there is a public space, which is the endless conversation on the internet. And one of the interesting aspects of that is that a lot of the conversation, as we know, is extremely bitter and ugly, and not at all reasoned. I think the idea of a public space where problems can be addressed openly does not take enough into account the unwillingness of people or the inability of people, many people, to argue rationally or to follow logic, and instead creates a forum for an extreme expressions of emotion. So that's something I think that has never really been taken into account when thinking about the sort of certain aspects of democracy. The model for us might be the town meeting in New England, where people kind of kept a lot of that emotion at bay because they were physically, personally exposed in the public space. That's not the case in the internet, and so unfortunately, we've had this other phenomenon. I also want to talk about. I also want to just add one more thing. I want to talk about change in the way that you described it, because we are really in an era in the U.S. in which there has been abundant change in a very short period of time, and a lot of that really has to do with social norms or social expectations. Most specifically, of course, the newfound or newly acknowledged civil liberties of gay people, but other things as well. And what you call the trumpeters and the Sanders people, I see this as an expression of dissatisfaction with the status quo coming from two different directions. I think that the people who support Trump are people who fear change and do not want change, and as Trump likes to trumpet, make America great again. That is, return to a previous era, return to some earlier state of things. Whereas the people who are and as a consequence, their critique of government is that government has done bad things to make bad changes, specifically the social changes. And the people who are supporting Sanders, on the other hand, I think see the changes that we've seen as good but not enough, and want to see government as the agent of change. And so these two groups are in an opposition, each of which really have within them or among them the possibility of actors in a revolution. But unfortunately, since they're pretty much evenly divided in the country, the promise is much greater for civil war than it is for revolution.
Roger, can you hear me?
Yes.
I can hear you.
Um, Taking off on what the last speaker said about the New England town meeting, I think that too is nostalgic and an attempt to return to the past. And I think that the internet and television have helped to suck the air out of that kind of face-to-face. Of course, face-to-face does serve to moderate people's wildest self-indulgent claims, but I don't know. I'm very pessimistic. Here in Minnesota, we used to have caucuses, and there's a bill making its way through the state legislature to change that into a primary. Well, the reason being the caucuses are so poorly attended. When I first started going to them in the 1960s, there was hardly standing room. And now the last time I went, I was the only person from my township who was there. So, something's happening and somehow we have to accommodate ourselves, but it doesn't look good.
That's a really good point. And I just want to say, I mean, Bob Meyerson just said something about the nostalgia for town meetings. And there's this part of me that has a nostalgia for them, but also for the caucus system. I've always found the caucus system to be more meaningfully democratic than the primary system. Instead of just going and flipping a lever or filling out a little dot, you actually talk to people face to face and everything. And yet, one of the things you've seen in this particular election cycle is that, at least on the Democratic side, and I think on the Republican side, the caucus states and the primary states have largely picked different candidates. Bernie Sanders has won most of the caucus states, and Hillary Clinton won most of the primary states. And I think Trump generally loses caucus states, whereas Cruz did better in caucus states. And one claim is that one's more democratic, but on the other hand, so many fewer people vote in caucus states that then people are saying that those are undemocratic. And you're in a situation in which what seems to be the more idealistic way of executing a democracy, namely caucuses, seems to also leave the hands of power in a very few people who show up and spend the time caucusing. That may not be so bad from an Arendtian point of view. So if you look to the end of this essay, this interview, she talks about this idea of the council system, something she also talks about in On Revolution. And what she says in both of them is that it may, in a caucus system, or in what she calls worker councils, everyone is allowed to participate, but most people won't, because in the end, let's be honest, she says most people don't really want to engage in politics. They don't really have that much interest in it. But those who do in a caucus system will be able to, and those who have some facility for it will rise up and have more persuasive power and more influence. And what she says is that this will create a political elite based on participation, which is different from what she sees as the political elite we have now, based on party loyalty and party graft. And what she says is that we'd rather have a political elite based on those who participate and want to engage than a political elite based on sort of graft and nepotism and you pat my back, I pat yours. So in a sense, what she says is we should accept the elitism of a few who, in a sense, run politics, as long as A, everyone is open to the system, no one is excluded, and B, the people who are the elite rise up because of their actions and their participation, and not because they bought their way in or were picked by somebody. And so maybe, so I find that these are, so in a way, the idea would be keep the caucus system, Minnesota, right, Bob? And accept the fact that the few people who participate govern because they're the ones who are most interested. And everyone can do it if they find themselves upset. I don't know what you guys think of that, but that's how I might take her argument to run.
Roger? Oh, I have no audio. Shoot.
Hi, Ray. How are you? Are you there, Ray? You have to turn your mic on. Ray, you have to turn your mic on. It was on. It got turned off. You have to hit audio on the right side. Hit the audio on button.
Thank you. Having some technical problems. You can hear me now? I'd just like to ask you what you think of the, we're talking about the political elite, and when that comes up against the elite that was exposed in the Panama Papers, I just feel like it almost feels hopeless to me.
I think a lot of us, I think a lot of people feel that way, and yet also the renewed activism among both sides of the spectrum is, I think, a sign for some hope. Whether it leads to something or not is up for questions. I mean, I think what you've seen in this campaign is, one thing that's hopeful is that Bernie Sanders and Donald Trump both raised, Bernie Sanders raised more money in this campaign than anybody except Jeb Bush. What you've seen is that big donors, which we think run politics and, let's be honest, have a huge influence, did not run this election. The big donor candidate of Jeb Bush did not go anywhere. And in the Democratic side, even though Hillary Clinton is going to win, the small donor candidate actually raised more money than the big donor candidate. So that to me has to strike us as hopeful in some way, which is that even at a time in which our campaign finance system seems unbelievably broken and the game seems fixed, we live in a country that is vibrant enough in its democracy, I think, that if people want to, they can resist the sway of big money. Maybe I'm wrong. Maybe I'm being too hopeful, but that's how I at least have in some way read what happened in this election cycle. I'm happy to hear people tell me I'm being naively optimistic. I have that tendency at times.
Roger, Harold here. I don't think you're naively optimistic, but I would say that within the primary, and I think it's really important for everyone to understand the percentages of a primary and who's involved and what the costs are for someone like Bernie Sanders to make it through the primary system and with limited staff, because he has so much volunteerism, which is a good thing. But one of the things related to that is on page 212, she says, and before she talks about expropriation, which I think is really important. All our experiences, as distinguished from theories and ideologies, tell us that the process of expropriation, which started with the rise of capitalism, of course, anti-capitalism, capitalism, same thing, it's all expropriation, does not stop with the expropriation of the means of production. Only legal and political institutions that are independent of the economic forces and their automatism can control and check the inherently monstrous potentialities of this process. And she goes on, what protects freedom is the division between governmental and economic power. And for me, a student of the threefold social order, this is her hinting at the threefold social order, where you have the cultural, the political, and the economic realm, and those do overlap, but I would say that she's hit the nail on the head with what goes on here, because the economics of what goes on in this country control it all. The war, the whole thing, it's all based on this economic thing. And I think what's important is that when you get to a general election, then the big money is going to count. If Bernie gets the nomination, are there going to be enough $27 to compete with the big money, which is going to want to preserve this status quo? Thanks.
Thanks, Harold. It's a good question. I think we also have to hear that what protects freedom, as you read, is the division between government and economic power. Between governmental and economic power, the fact that the state and its constitution are not superstructures. You need to protect politics from economic power. And I think that could be easily seen as an argument for publicly funded elections, and independence, people who are paid enough in government so that they don't have to work, etc. I mean, there's a lot of things you could tie to it, but what she also says is that you have to separate out government from the economy. One of the things that she's quite critical of, as you know, because you mentioned the social and the political, is the rise of government as an economic actor. And to me, that's one of the blindnesses of the kind of Bernie Sanders campaign in the modern time, from an Arendtian point of view, is the desire to expand the economic role of government more and more, which is one of his goals, is to, I think, to her, a blurring of an important blurring and a dangerous blurring of the lines between government and economics that would protect freedom. She does say, though, that the best way political controls seem to function best in what she calls a welfare states, whether they call themselves socialist or capitalist. And I think that's important to remember. She's not against welfare. She's always in interviews and in conversations, and at a conference in Toronto in 1972 where this issue was really raised quite directly, she's always come out in favor of welfare. I think the difference is that she has a very different idea of welfare than we do today. She thinks less vigorous view of welfare than many of us would today. And by that I mean she thinks welfare means that the basic necessities of life are cared for and taken care of, and it stops there. And the worry is that, I think what she's saying is that as dangerous to freedom, as dangerous as capitalism and economic power is to freedom, so is governmental power to freedom when it becomes driven by economic and social concerns. And this is one of her recurring themes throughout her work, and her worry about the rise of the social question. So I agree, Harold. I just, I'm not sure where you stand on that, but I think she has a very strong worry that the administrative state and the social welfare state, as it expands, is as dangerous to freedom potentially as capitalism is, which of course is one of the main views of people on the right in this country. But she also sees capitalism as dangerous to freedom. So she's neither. This is part of this attempt on her part that I talked about earlier in response to Jade's question about trying to think non-ideologically and to try and, in her mind, think the truth of where we are now outside of thinking I'm a leftist or I'm a rightist, I'm a capitalist, I'm a socialist. Those kind of labels and ideologies are for her not helpful in analyzing the truth of the situation.
I'm sorry if the recording is microphone is bad, Roger, but I want to get back a little bit to the Caucus system, the nostalgia for the Caucus system, or in Arendt's version here, calling it the council system. As she mentions, they've always been defeated by one thing or another, bureaucracy or party machines. If you take that point of view, I don't find the Caucus system the best way to do it. The idea that if you're a registered Democrat, you're ideologically sort of isolated, and if you're registered as an independent, you're sort of smarter and independent, is to me a false. Those are false characterizations. I happen to be registered independent as a Democrat. By and large, Democrats, we kind of think the same way, not because I, going to always vote for a Democrat or not. I always resent this independent idea when we talk about caucuses and the idea that they are, more intellectually looking at the issues and so on. And I say that the caucus system or a council system, I think the evolution of that would be into a multi-party situation where you'd have to have coalitions and things like that, which can be just as complicated and defeatist as any other situation. I'm not arguing that we shouldn't have more than two parties, but the idea of having multi-parties, because people tend to go to those caucuses who are not with a sort of, in my opinion, let me just put it that way, with one issue in mind. In this case, it happens to be campaign finance reform, as you mentioned earlier. Or if you're on Trump's side, they go there because they're anti-immigrant. They're going to go for people who are on a one issue, essentially. That's what woke them up. As we say, most people aren't interested in politics, and they get interested if they have that one issue that's of their concern at that time. I may have said too much, but thanks for the time.
Yeah, thanks, Patrick. I think that's it. I don't think the caucus system has to in any way be party based, although it could be. It could just be. The councils are certainly not party based; they're government based, and in a sense nonpartisan. But today the caucus system is largely, I think, party based. Maybe I don't. I'm not in a caucus state, so I've actually never had the privilege, or I don't know, the pain, whichever it is, of going to a caucus. I have a romanticization of them outside of ever having attended one, like Bob has. Other responses to that, or other ideas?
Maybe I'd like to hear. Yeah. Maybe I'd like to hear what the non-Americans think about this, what their experience, what their opportunities are.
Are there anyone from outside the country that wants to participate in this? I know some of you are here.
It's Donna from Tokyo via Australia. Can you hear me?
Yes. Welcome, Donna.
Yeah, it's interesting because I'm just recently moved to Tokyo to look very closely at the rising student movements in opposition to the government's moves on security and so on. But I also come from, I still am, an Australian citizen where we do have the two major parties, but increasingly we're getting agitation to have other parties become much more involved in the system. The Greens, for example, have recently been more successful in getting people elected into the federal parliament and so on. So we're starting to see this diversification, I guess, of a major two-party system. But what I liked about, or what interested me about Arendt's discussion there of the councils there towards the end and this discussion of federation, I wanted to ask you, Roger, had she read Immanuel Kant's Perpetual Peace in detail prior to writing this particular piece, or was she still formulating her ideas? Because it had a lot of parallels for me with his idea of the Federation in Perpetual Peace, which I also happen to be working on at the moment. But just want your comments on that, please.
Yeah, thanks, Donna. So briefly on that, yeah, I mean, she certainly had read Kant's Perpetual Peace by then, and I should say that she'd been talking about federations since the 1940s. During the war and immediately after the war, she and a number of other people wrote a lot about federations and how Europe should be a federation, but also she really thought about it within the context of Israel and Palestine. She has a number of essays in which, she says that the idea of a single Jewish state in Israel would be a disaster in her mind, because no matter how democratic or how tolerant people wanted to be, in the end, as with any national state, one nationality would be elevated above the others, and there would be a majority nationality and a minority nationality. And so her solution was to create a binational state in which you had workers' councils around a federal system, a federal structure. And that was and clearly she had a lot of sources for this, but Kant was one of them already back then in the 40s and 50s. So this idea of federalism, and if you read On Revolution, which is a book we may want to read at some point as a group, in chapters 4 of On Revolution, she calls the federalist principle of the United States government the most important innovation in politics that America brings to the world. And it's important to understand by that, she doesn't simply mean federalism, because obviously there's other federalist systems around the world, but she means the federalist principle in which there was no sovereign power. And she saw the United States government, as it emerged out of the 1789 Constitution, as a situation in which there was no sovereign. There was the federal government split in three between the executive, judiciary, and legislative branches. Then there were the states. Then there were counties. There were non-governmental intermediate organizations. And she really thought that the way the spirit of America and the way that spirit was embodied in the Constitution meant that if any one part of the American government became too powerful, the others would become increasingly powerful through citizen action and resist it and knock it down a couple pegs. And she thought that the system was built such that there was no sovereign center and there was no sovereignty in the states. The federal government could oppose the states could oppose the federal government, the counties and the people could oppose the states and the federal government. And she thought that this would protect, this federalist principle was unique in the world, had never happened before, and really could protect freedom in a way that no other sovereign-oriented system could. She thinks that has been lost. I'm not sure whether it has been or not. I mean, I think the rise of the student movements in the 60s and now the rise of both the Tea Party and the Occupy and it's their heirs now, I think really does suggest a kind of federalist. There are institutions by which power can emerge in the United States to oppose this power in the center. That said, and I'm sorry, there's no doubt that the centralization of power in the United States has been growing in a single direction basically for the last 100 years or 80 years, and is continuing to grow. And from her point of view, that's the greatest danger to freedom in the country, which is why I think the rise the idea that you want to increase the size and the power of the central government, right? The Sanders idea would be one that's very scary to her. By the way, that's only one side of it. There have been two main driving forces behind the increase in size and power of the central government. One has been progressivism and the liberal social welfare state, but the other has been the national security state, right? The idea that we are increasing at a constant rate the power of the federal government to surveil and control citizens in the name of national security. And that has often been something that the right has embraced. So she sees both of these movements of centralization as deeply, deeply dangerous.
Roger Howard again. I think your analysis is right on, and I really think the election process in this year is very important because it's going to go beyond the primaries. It's going into the election. The third-party candidates, particularly Joe Stein, who is presumably the candidate for the Green Party, is on the internet and doing things. The third parties have a lawsuit pending to gain participation into the presidential debates. I think the system is being challenged on a lot of different levels, and exactly what Arendt said would happen is happening. Whether or not it will happen within 12 months or 10 years, who knows? But I think there's something going on beyond the issues or the two sides. I think there is a revolution really beginning, but it's just at the very beginnings.
Anyone else want to jump in? I mean, I can keep responding, but I know there's a lot of opinions out there and on a lot of opinions amongst you fellows. So love to hear what you have to say.
I'd like to say something about a problem of the development of leadership in a revolution. One of the things that history has taught us pretty well is that no matter what the origin is of the elite, as soon as there is in fact an elite, it is quickly followed upon by corruption of the elite. And corruption is not only of the elite, of course. Corruption reaches down into the entire society. But so we have, for example, let's take the example of Ramsay MacDonald, who I think was a product of councils of the type that Hannah Arendt would have liked, who ascended to leadership of the entire country and then proved to be quite corruptible. So, I think one of the issues that isn't defined that way, but is clearly at the core of what is taking place in the election in the U.S. is this issue of corruptibility, of the corruption of the elite, whether that is the government elite or the ownership elite or even the academic elite, that the faith in institutions altogether is based on exposure of corruption in every elite. And I'm not so sure that when leadership arises to struggle against that corruption, that when it is in positions of leadership, when it actually acquires the power, whether it will be free of corruption.
Yeah, I want to say a couple things about that because I think it's an important point. One is that one thing that's required by seeing things like they are and saying what is, as Arendt asks us to do, is to not sugarcoat things and to admit that people act out of all sorts of interests. And while there are idealists and people who will martyr themselves and sacrifice their interests for a greater good. And we should not forget that those people exist and they're important. That's not the majority of people. And there will always be corruption at all levels. And so for her, the point is not to change human nature. Human nature is as it is. We can provide inspiration and examples of uncorruptible people to hope to inspire people to act that way, but it's not going to happen in a mass level. And so the point is to create structural governmental organizations and structures that neutralize to as much as possible the bad effects of that corruption. So, for example, you create multiple power sources, not one central power, so that if one becomes corrupted, others can spring up and oppose it. When those become corrupted, others can spring up and oppose it. And to her, that pluralism of power is absolutely essential. I should also say that for her, because of the structure of the American Constitution and the American government, she became less worried about governmental corruption. What she said is, because if any one part of government becomes corrupt, others will emerge to oppose it, or could emerge to oppose it. The danger in America is not governmental corruption, it's corruption of the people. And by that, she means that the people care more about their private interest than the public interest and don't get involved and don't participate in politics. And in a sense, leave the activity of government to a corrupt party elite. That's the real danger for her. And with that in mind, the way that she thinks you fight that kind of corruption of the people is by providing them with institutional spaces for public engagement. And that's why the councils and the town hall governments and the caucuses are so important. It's not that the caucuses and councils are always good, and it's not that they always do the right thing, or that always 100 people go to them instead of 1 people, right? It's that the spaces are there so that when the people go to them, they can participate and they can enjoy it. They can realize how much fun it is, and they can get in the habit of doing it. Well, then there may be times when it's less fun because there's not many issues that they care about, and they retreat from the public. But the institutions remain there. And I think one of the things that I've come to appreciate about Hannah Arendt in the last 3 or 4 years is how much of an institutional thinker she is. I mean, she really thinks that institutions matter, and that you have to create institutions that take into account the fact that people are corruptible and imperfect. I mean, one of the reasons Donald Trump is a real pill as far as I can tell, and very boorish. But one of the reasons I'm not worried about him, in a sense, destroying the United States, which of course is a low bar, right? I'm just saying this, is because we live in a country in which there are institutional breaks on any one position of power. So those like Andrew Sullivan just wrote in an article this week about worried that he could become a dictator and a tyrant. We have a Congress, and we have a Supreme Court, and we have states, and we have other organizations of power in this country. And as dangerous as he may be, and there's a lot of reasons to think he might be dangerous, as might be other people, the idea that as long as someone respects the constitutional structures of power in this country, it would be very hard for this country to descend into a kind of tyranny. And I think that's Arendt's hope. I mean, there's always the danger that someone would change the Constitution and do so with popular support. And that, of course, is a very real danger, and one we should be quite worried about.
Isn't a good example of the balancing what's happening in New York with Skelos and Silver.
I think that's right.
Of the law being the balancing one or the corrective one. I thought that
somewhat, although, Patrick, you're right. you're right, except, on the other hand, we haven't been able to get, those of us who live in New York, we haven't been able to get an actual real campaign finance or campaign reform act through Albany, which has been shocking given the fact that now I don't know how many, but dozens of people have now been convicted of these kinds of crimes.
But I'm just thinking that the judicial system is a brake, at least from time to time, on situations like corruption at the highest levels.
Yeah, I think that's right.
I think from her point of view, the American Constitution, the American system is of, in human history is not the perfect system, but the best we can hope for. And that includes the judicial system.
Well, Arendt thought so, although she worried that it was becoming too centralized and that the states and the local governments were losing their power, and she saw the states and counties and even wards or councils as essential brakes on the power of the federal government. And to her, that was the great danger that we faced. We also have to remember that, I think the president that Trump would most look like if he were elected would be Andrew Jackson, who was a demagogue of sorts and the first truly democratic president who did away with the elite Bank of America, and also when the Supreme Court intervened to try and stop him from clearing out Indian reservations, Native American reservations, said the famous statement, "Let the Supreme Court and its army try and stop me." There is a division of power. There are breaks in our system, but there are potentials for a very popular demagogic figure to blur, if not overrun, some of those breaks. Now, I mean, Jackson didn't overrun all of them, and they were restored. But we should never be complacent, I guess, is what I also want to say. Even though I think we have institutional resources that something like not the Weimar Republic did not have, one should never be complacent.
The pendulum swings from time to time, and that's what Trump's pendulum is swinging in his direction. And there's always the time. Some things simply take time.
Yep. We got about 2 or 3 minutes. Does anyone have a final comment?
I guess if I could just come back in with a Tokyo perspective, just on your talk of not having someone change the constitution. The interesting thing about the student demonstrations that have been generated in the last 8 or 9 months is, in fact, the present Prime Minister Abe's complete desire to want to change the constitution, particularly Article 9 and its relevant articles there with the peace constitution, and that because it's been seen as a fairly ineffectual institution, the parliament itself, with the opposition parties. This has really brought out a lot of people, starting with the students, but throughout society. So just in terms of what you're talking about now, Roger, I see it as a really interesting example perhaps of how this, what might come after the institution, or what's actually happening here. It's given me some wonderful things to think about. Thank you very much.
That's great, Donna. Thanks. And we should note that there are a number of authoritarian leaders around the world now trying to change their state constitutions. Brazil, Venezuela recently, Turkey going on right now, and even Austria. There's worry that Mr. Hofer, if he becomes the candidate, the president, he won the first round, and now there's a runoff in May. There's talk that the president in Austria can suspend the constitution. And so these are real problems. And that's, to me, and that's, of course, what the Nazi Party did, the National Socialists did in 1932 or 33 when it took over power. Just because there are constitutional limits, you can never and should never become complacent about people who might use popularity and popular will to overtake those limits, which is why Arendt says in On Revolution that no law and no constitution as a law will ever be enough to stop power. and to break power from becoming absolute if it wants to. The only thing that can check power, she says, is power. And power doesn't come from laws. It comes from people acting together, which is why it's so important to keep people involved and active in politics, which is why you need spaces of politics where people can act and acquire and build power when it's needed. And that, for her, is the only way to preserve freedom and protect against the kind of tyranny that we've seen emerge and can emerge again.
I'd like to add something here, if there's time. I'd like to add that in the United States today, there is an increased quantity of political action taking place among the populace. And almost all of it is in defense of the First Amendment to the Constitution. That is, that both left and right are perceiving that rights as guaranteed by the First Amendment are being abridged. And so there are different interpretations of what those things mean. There are people who, a good example, I think, is the way in which people think about the freedom of religion. And I think that both left and right are very oppressed by what has happened to the press and how the press has acted in the current political situation. So it's interesting. I'm a little less optimistic than you are, Roger, because I believe that a very large portion of the United States is in opposition over the basic principles of the country.
It's a downer here. Your microphone is off, Roger.
I'm sorry. Thank you. I'm going to let Jack have the last word. I'm going to say that we'll continue these conversations next month. I think we'll try and read again from the same book, Crises of the Republic, the essay Civil Disobedience, one of her most extraordinary and really unique essays. I hope you all have a chance to join us when we meet next month. Thank you all very much, and keep enjoying reading Hannah Arendt. I'll see you soon.
Thanks, Roger.